Good evening, friends. This is Steve with Real Progressives. Joe Firestone was kind enough to give us a Tuesday night with Joe instead of our regular Saturday night slot. And Joe was also kind enough to do the Tour de DC to come out there and see all of us Real Progressive fans of his at the Workers' March at McPherson Square on Sunday. So here we are tonight getting ready to talk to Joe about your favorite president of all time, progressives, Donald Trump. But we're going to talk taxes and we're going to talk trade through an MMT perspective. Before we get there, I want to make some points real quickly, so I don't want Joe to have to suffer through me explaining this. So I'm keeping Joe off screen for a moment. Folks, this business is really hard. And it's sometimes pretty thankless. And, our families all do a tremendous sacrifice in allowing us to pursue our passions. As you know, Real Progressives is trying to do more than just live streams and Facebook. We're trying to build websites. We're trying to build a media entity. We're trying to build an activism arm. We're trying to build an education entity, and we're trying to build a policy wing. So there's a lot going on here that we're trying to do. Unfortunately, this movement is sadly filled with human beings. And human beings tend to be selfish, and they tend to be short-sighted, and they tend to be self-seeking, and they tend to look out for number one first. And sadly, that happens more often than you will ever know. Now, for this Real Progressive, it is very, very painful to go through repeat episode after repeat episode after repeat episode of selfish, egotistical, short-sighted people that don't realize that we're trying to save lives, that we're trying to fund the entire revolution by taking the one area that no other progressive outlet is actually discussing. And here we are, we feel like we're lifting the weight of a mountain, trying to carry this ball forward, as we have people even within our own movement negging that. And so it's with great pain in my heart that I tell you that our movement is full of human beings. And human beings are very, 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 very selfish. Very, very short-sighted. And folks, unless we rectify the selfishness and short-sightedness of this movement, it really is going to fail. It doesn't matter how human we are. So sadly, you're going to see more and more and more failures in our movement till it stops being a movement because of self-seeking, because of selfishness, because of arrogance, because of ego, because of unwillingness to learn, because of being a full cup thinking you know everything. Whatever it is, our movement requires malleable people that are willing to absorb new information, that are willing to put self over here and put the movement first, realizing we're trying to save lives. However, as I've said before, we are filled with selfish humans that don't really care how many die as long as they're pursuing their selfishness. And folks, for our movement to be successful, we not only need to do each one teach one, but we need each one to reach one to make sure that these people stop the selfishness, stop the self-destructive evil that fills their heart as they pull into selfish ways, and they try to destroy things that are seeking to save lives. So without further ado, let me bring on Joe Firestone for a minute. Sir Joe, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing very well, Stephen. How are you doing?
I'm human, buddy. I'm human. So
not yet fully recovered from Saturday's activities.
Not quite at all. I'm trying. I'm super exhausted. I'm stuffed up. I'm feeling it. But I tell you what, the subject matter that you want to talk about tonight is more than ample reason to get hyped and amped to do this stream, because folks need to know what is it about the Trump tax plan and we should be paying attention to, and how to view it through the lens of modern monetary reality, and also his trade policies and how a modern money economy would take a look and view those policies. So, Joe, thank you, sir, for taking your time tonight. Educate us, brother. What's going on? Tell me about Trump's plan.
Okay. I want to start with a little reminder, okay, or background concerning the macroeconomic sectoral transactions among the three sectors of the economy of the United States. There is a government sector, there is a domestic non-government sector, okay, or some might say the private sector, and there is a foreign sector. And there is an accounting identity, an equation, okay, a model when it's interpreted as it is when we use it to describe the real world. And that equation is, what you need to keep in mind, okay, is that the surplus or deficit in the government sector within a particular time period, plus the surplus or deficit within the domestic non-government sector, plus the surplus or deficit within the foreign sector, has to be equal to zero, okay, according to the model. So, here goes then. If the foreign sector has a surplus, okay, then that means, very roughly speaking, that there is a trade deficit, okay, in our economy. It means that the foreign sector, in its transactions with us, is making more money in U.S. dollars than we are. Okay. When the government sector is also in surplus, and that means the sum of these two sectors together is going to have to be balanced by a domestic non-government sector that is negative, that is in deficit. Because if the other two sectors are positive, the third sector must be negative. There's no way around that. Okay, and if it's negative, that means that the domestic non-government sector or the private sector is running a deficit in U.S. money for that year. I should be more precise and say in net financial assets for that year. And we could have a situation where this goes on for a number of years. It might be 3% or 4% of GDP each year. And by the time 4 or 5 years have passed, suddenly the net financial assets of the private sector are far less than when the government began to run surpluses 4 or 5 years before. Now, for the private sector in the aggregate, the non-government sector in the aggregate, to be making money, as it were, to be making net financial assets, to have a positive balance within any period of time, okay, if the foreign sector is going to be positive, it must be the case that the government sector that in more common sense terms, or terms you're more used to hearing, it must be the case that the government is running a budget deficit. And the budget deficit also has to be greater than the foreign sector surplus, because that's the only way to balance off the foreign sector surplus and get to the point where the non-government or private sector is at least at zero, at least not losing net financial assets, okay, within that period of time. And moreover, the budget deficit by the government, if one wants the private sector to be making money within a particular time period, to have a surplus, okay, within a particular time period, the government sector must have a deficit which is greater than the surplus which the foreign sector has. So, if in the area of trade, the rest of the world, specifically the foreign sector, is making, let's say, 4% of our GDP, then just to keep things even for the private sector, the government sector has to have a budget deficit of 4%, okay, of GDP. Okay, and if the government sector wants the non-government sector to make a healthy profit for the year, say roughly 5% of GDP, then it will be necessary for the government sector to have a deficit of first the 4% to balance off the foreign sector's surplus, plus the 5% that that government would like to see the private sector accumulating during that particular period of time. Or it will have to have a total deficit of 9%, okay, of GDP. Now let's sort of round that off a little to 10%. And what are we looking at in dollars today? We're looking at a deficit of $1.9 trillion that's needed for the private sector to be getting ahead by 5%, okay, of GDP. However, the Congressional Budget Office forecast by the end of March of fiscal 2017 that but the government was only going to run a budget deficit of $522 billion this year. So that was the projection. Now, I expect that probably the government will go into deficit a little more than that for the rest of the year. I'm guessing it's going to come in at $600 billion and not at $522 billion. But that still leaves it $1.3 trillion short in terms of having a deficit that would be adequate to give the private sector a gain of 5% for this particular fiscal year. Now, here comes Don John, or actually, I guess it's Don Joe, isn't it? And here he comes in with his tax plan. And according to various estimates, the various kinds of tax relief that he's going to give to various sectors of the economy are such that they will amount to anywhere from $3 trillion over 10 years to $7 trillion over 10 years. Now, on the surface, that sounds like a very, very large sum, and currently the mainstream in Washington is going a little crazy over it. and saying, oh, how irresponsible it all is. Some of the criticisms are justified. They focus on the fact that the heaviest emphasis of the tax cuts is on giving lower taxes to corporations and private individuals who are, to begin with, extremely well off. So keeping that in mind, let us go through the features of the tax plan as we know it so far. His tax plan, based on a one-page document released by the White House, about 11 days ago or something like that, featured the following goals of his tax plan. First of all, growth, more rapid economic growth, creating millions of jobs. Okay. Also, the tax plan is supposed to simplify the tax code and to provide tax relief for middle-income families. It also has a goal of lowering the business tax rates from one of the highest in the world to one of the lowest in the world. So, now let's break it down into categories, as the Trump administration did in releasing this one-page tax plan. Now, as you might imagine, when we get into the details of this, in a single page, there couldn't be very many details at all. And so there are not very many details at all. Let's take the category of tax relief for Americans, especially middle-income families. Right now, we have 7 tax brackets. Just off the record, it doesn't seem to me that's enough tax brackets. All I know is that after you get up to about, 479,000 or something like that, tax rates seem to flatten out. So people who, while they're prosperous and maybe in the upper middle class, are paying tax rates, which, not counting deductions and loopholes and all kinds of other tricks, okay, that these people can pay, is no more than the income tax paid by Bill Gates and thousands of the super rich, okay, and the billionaires. And it sort of seems like, from the justice and fairness standpoint, that one would want to have a number of other tax brackets in there just for the people who make over $479,000 a year, okay, in income, just for fairness' sake. Okay, not because we need the money now, because, as we know very well here, but taxes are not for funding spending. They do not fund spending, but have a number of other purposes. And one of them is fairness in burden sharing. So he wants to reduce the tax rates to 3, or the tax brackets to 3, I should say. A 10% bracket, a 25% bracket, and a 35% bracket. Since the maximum bracket now is 39.6%, he's proposing a reduction in the highest tax bracket, which includes the billionaires and the 100 millionaires, and people in those spots. He wants to reduce their taxes by 4.6% of their gross, the gross adjusted income, okay, which in itself is grossly lower than what they really have, because we're only talking about here the income, okay, from wages, okay, and from other things not subject to the loopholes that exist in the tax law. Okay, besides that, he wants to do something for regular people, so he wants to double the standard deduction to $24,000. However, to go along with that, he's also suggested that certain of the exemptions, like state and local taxes, which are now there to lower the taxes that working people pay, be ended. So it becomes debatable whether doubling the deduction from $12,700 to $24,000 would really represent very much of a tax break for working people and middle-income people. So, third, he also wants to provide tax relief for families with child and dependent care expenses. Now, those who've been following the news as entertainment surely know that this was a hot item for Ivanka Trump, because she and some of her closest friends don't get to deduct their child and dependent care expenses. And they've been thinking that's extraordinarily unfair, okay, and unjust. And so this was a hot button for them. They wanted tax relief for that. Now, to be fair, that kind of tax relief is likely to benefit a lot of middle-income people also, who currently have extraordinary child and dependent care expenses. Sure. Simplification, that's the next category, other than just the tax relief, okay, for Americans. But you're going to see that there's more tax relief in here with simplification. He wants to eliminate the targeted tax breaks that are currently mainly benefiting the wealthiest. That seems to be a provision which, on balance, could be a very good one. He also says he wants to protect home ownership and charitable deductions. So basically, it's not a part of his tax plan to change the provisions for those things. In other words, his changes do not extend to charitable deductions and to the deductions one gets when one is a homeowner. But on the other side, he wants to repeal the alternative minimum tax and the inheritance taxes. Okay, now what would that do? Well, first of all, this is in the context of years of reduction of the taxes already by the Republicans since the Bush administration, always making deals to reduce the inheritance taxes so their children can inherit far more money. Okay. Now, in this case, Trump, as everyone knows, telling everybody that his fortune is $9 billion. Well, he wants to see to it that his children get all of the $9 billion. And so here he is, he's putting forward a provision in the law which will greatly benefit him and his family. And by now we know that that's a pattern in many of the things which he, is advocating for. He advocates for legislation and for executive orders and for international trading relationships, which are very advantageous to himself. So the AMT, the alternative minimum tax, now that's a tax that was actually installed originally, I believe, by Ronald Reagan, strangely. Ronald Reagan was exercised, or felt that some people in his movement, were exercised by the fact that up till that time, the law did not actually prevent extremely rich people taking advantage of deductions of certain kinds who had a lot of income, in each year, offsetting that income with deductions to the point that they paid no income tax, at all. He found that intolerable, and so as part of his rounds of tax cutting and later some tax increases, he also put in the AMT. So no matter how many deductions somebody had, they would always be paying a minimum. I guess his minimum, I believe, was, I'm not sure whether it was 10% or 15%, I forget now, but it was in that range, And the AMT has remained in that range since that time and is still in place. And Donald Trump, in the tax return, 2005 tax return, which he made public, or a part of which he leaked, I guess. Rachel Maddow got a hold of it, and she made it public. This was probably a purposeful leak on Trump's part. It was found that that year, if he had paid the AMT, I guess he did pay the AMT that year, and the AMT cost him $31 million that year. And I guess he resented it. I guess he wasn't sufficiently rich in 2005. So he resented the loss of $31 million to the federal government. So in this bill, he proposes to get even by eliminating the alternative minimum tax so that it can never happen to good folks like him. Next, he wants to repeal the 3.8% Obamacare tax on small businesses and investment income. Now, of course, we know that he's not been successful so far in repealing Obamacare, but here through the back door, because, of course, if that 3.8% tax is repealed, then Obamacare will no longer be a fiscally neutral program, and it will be more vulnerable to Republican attacks as part of the federal budget, causing a horrible deficit spending. Now, how they're going to claim that such spending is so horrible when they're about to embark on $7 trillion worth of deficit spending over 10 years, I don't know, but I'm sure they'll find a way to propagandize that. They always seem to be pretty successful at that. And finally, right now, for corporations, and for individuals too, I guess, but we have a system of worldwide taxation, pretty unique system. In other words, we tax them on their profits, their total profits, if they are U.S. corporations. And that's in part why they've been leaving their money overseas, so we can't get at it to tax it. So one of the things he wants to do is to make our taxes or our tax system a territorial system, so that we tax these multinational corporations only on what they make inside of the United States. Now, he doesn't seem to be concerned by the fact that they're already expert at practices whereby they produce goods overseas, sell them to their subsidiaries here at relatively high costs. So their profits here are minimal, so their profits stay overseas where they can hide them away or leave them taxable by low tax jurisdictions where they have the companies selling the goods and services into their subsidiaries here in the United States. So, he wants to give up the game of trying to make these companies responsible from a tax point of view for worldwide profits, and simply restrict it to what they earn here, which they then can freely manipulate. So this is his wonderful tax plan that he's been trumpeting to all of us. Unfortunately, we can't go through all of the different features of the tax plan and all of the hidden catch-22s in this tax plan and all of the highly negative things in this tax plan, because right now there are no details of this tax plan out. And the way Trump is going to proceed on this is to work with congressional leaders on both sides to hammer out a deal. And one reason why he kept it so vague was because he doesn't want to be bound by very much in the way of details here. He just wanted to use this as an overall outline to deal both with the Republicans and the Democrats to try to get his so-called tax reform plan, in actual fact, a tax looting plan. He wants to get that approved. So, here are some more features of the tax plan. There are also business tax reforms. He thinks business taxes are too high at 35%. And never mind the fact that in the 1950s, 35% or around there of federal tax revenue came from the corporations. And but today, that percentage is down to 9% of all the tax revenues. In other words, they've managed to knock it down as a proportion of tax revenues of the federal government by 3/4. They've shrunk it by 3/4. Okay. But that is not enough for him. He wants to drive the tax rate itself down to 15%. So that they will pay even less. And he justifies his territorial tax system, which I just spoke about, as a way of leveling the playing field with multinational corporations that are headquartered overseas. Basically saying that, well, our corporations, our multinationals, are now going to be more competitive because they don't have to contend with our very high tax rates all over the world. Okay. So they won't have incentives anymore to move outside of the United States. And therefore, presumably, they're going to stay here. Okay. Now, what he also wants to do is to bring the trillions of dollars they have overseas, which of course assumes that we need the trillions of dollars here in the first place, that we need their trillions of dollars because we need to have them investing money here. When the truth really is that a nation with a sovereign currency doesn't really need their money to make investments. We can create money here and support whatever investments need to be made here by people who want to have their businesses here. We can just ignore their overseas money if we want to. But anyway, what he wants to do is to make a deal with them. He wants to give them a break on the money they repatriate from foreign shores that they bring back into the United States. He wants to put a one-time tax of trillions of dollars, and I'm sorry, a one-time tax on the trillions of dollars they hold overseas. But that tax, the details of which are not here yet, but which are likely to be at the 15% business tax rate, gives them a wonderful break from the 35% tax rates they should have been. So plainly, there's a moral hazard in this. Okay, that is to say, if they can get lower tax rates overseas, and so they prefer to, in the future, secrete money overseas, then some Republican of the future will have every incentive to offer them another tax deal. Maybe they'll bring the tax rate down from 15% to 7.5% then, or to 5%. In any case, he wants a one-time tax on trillions of dollars they hold overseas, but not at the rates that they were going to owe on those trillions of dollars. He thinks that they need to be rewarded for their bad behavior, which seems to be the way the federal government plays the game these days. We saw a lot of that during the Obama administration, also, but especially in the Obama administration compared to the Bush administration, constantly rewarding people for bad behavior. Okay. And then final thing he wants to do is to eliminate tax breaks for special interests. I don't know what he means there. There are no details on the special interests that he has in mind. It is very likely, it seems to me, that some of these tax breaks are for public purpose organizations that we would not consider to be special interests at all. But evidently, Mr. Trump considers certain groups to be special interests, but not himself, not his family, and not the plutocratic elites who are keeping their money outside of the United States and have been doing so for many, many years. So these are the features then of his wonderful tax plan. Now, we have to be very clear-eyed about one thing about this tax plan. It seems on the surface to be enormously unfair, and it is enormously unfair. It fails the test of tax justice. But that's a separate question from whether it contributes to macroeconomic austerity, which is an idea I've discussed here before at some length. I've said already that the estimates of how much this is going to cost the federal government in terms of the deficit bias inherent in the tax plan, and I want to emphasize here, I'm not saying a deficit bias is necessarily bad. Okay? I think I've already indicated that right now we have a deficit that was probably $1.3 trillion lower than what it ought to have been. So I'm not coming at this from the point of view that deficits are bad. But the estimates of what kind of deficit bias there is in this tax plan is that it's as low as $3 trillion over 10 years to as high as $7 trillion over 10 years. Now that's an average of $300 billion to $700 billion per year over 10 years. And usually the estimates in the models that do the projections are such that when there's a 10-year deficit in the offing, usually the high numbers of those deficits are because they provide a stimulus to the economy, which in turn provides increases in tax revenues for the later years of a 10-year period. And so the average may be 300 to 700 billion per year, but it's possible that when they get around to knowing exactly the details, that they'll actually be calculating something like 700 billion, like 900 billion in the first year, 900 billion in the second year, and smaller deficits in the out years. Okay. But since most of the tax cuts are focused on rich corporations and people, such deficits are not going to be like the Obama stimulus plan. His stimulus deficits, which stopped the fall into a depression and slowly created some jobs, had fiscal multipliers, okay, in excess of 1. I think people have been estimating that the primary fiscal multipliers within the Recovery Act were at the level of 1.2 or 1.3 over the period of effectiveness, which is roughly 3 years, okay, of the Recovery Act. But here, these tax cuts are focused on rich corporations and people, so they're much more like the Bush tax cuts were. And we know the Bush tax cuts had a likely fiscal multiplier of 30 cents on each dollar of tax cuts. So the stimulus provided in Trump's plan here, or the deficit bias, which is provided in Trump's plan here, is more like a 90 to 210 billion but primary shot to the economy as the federal money is spent, rather than the 300 billion to 700 billion, which would be true if the multiplier were at $1 for each dollar federal tax deduction, rather than the 30 cents. Okay. So this is not exactly a big stimulus for the private sector in 2018, which is the year this would become operative. Okay, if you look at the deficit right now, as I said, for this year, I think it's likely to go up to 600 billion for this year. Okay, so if it does, and the stimulus that is going to be provided by a tax cut that has the fiscal multiplier of 30 cents is really worth, let's say, 90 billion a year. So you can see this would be equivalent to the stimulus provided by a relatively small size in the deficit if it were being spent on the same things that our deficits now are being spent on. But this additional money, as I say, is focused on leaving more money in corporations and the rich people, extremely wealthy people, and they spend only 30 cents on each dollar of tax cuts, and they secrete the rest away. So we can say that there's going to be some stimulus here. It's not a situation of macroeconomic austerity, but neither is it really a very big stimulus. From the growth point of view, the $3 to $10 trillion over 10 years is not really something to write home about. For example, in 2017, the trade deficit is also likely to be around, or the foreign sector surplus, if you will, is likely to be around 600 billion, okay, in this year. So it's pretty much going to match the current deficit. So you can see, if you put another 90 to 210 trillion dollar stimulus on that, it's not going to produce that many additional jobs. It's not going to bring that many of the people who now want full-time jobs but can't find it into the full-time job market. Okay. But what are the other consequences of this tax plan? Well, without more deficit spending and without a credit bubble, in other words, there still may be more deficit spending in the Trump administration because, for example, he might get an infrastructure bill through which is not entirely paid for. And if he does that, if he runs some deficits there, that's likely to have a much higher fiscal multiplier. However, consider when he gets these big tax cuts through, he will have done a lot for himself and for the plutocratic elites. And they will be very, very happy with that. And meanwhile, on his flank, Paul Ryan and the austerity hawks in D.C. will be nipping at his heels talking about how horrible these deficits are that he has now, and that he has to do something to contain them and to remove the deficit bias in his tax cut plan, and that he must do that above all, or they will say the United States is going to run out of money. We're not going to have the money. So, so if that happens, there's not going to be more deficit spending. And of course, if he wants to run $700 billion per year in deficits, or even $300 billion a year, okay, in additional deficits, then Janet Yellen and the Federal Reserve is going to get upset, and they're going to work with monetary policy in the opposite direction, trying to suppress the labor market, trying to suppress wages in the market, playing the usual Fed game of reinforcing fiscal responsibility. So they're going to impose negative drag on the economy to offset what he's done, making the stimulus perhaps even less than I've stated thus far. So he's going to get pulling in the opposite direction from the Federal Reserve and from the Republicans, and probably from a lot of Democrats who are going to be attacking him all over the place for running these enormous deficits. Okay, you know, the regular progressives, not us, who think it's a sin to have deficits per se, and we must not, and we must be the fiscally responsible party and work towards deficit neutrality. And then they'll run against him on that. And it's one of the reasons why they overturn him in 2020. Then when they get in, their first order of business is going to be to say, oh, we have this horrible deficit problem created by Trump now. And our first order of business has to be not to lift up the economy, but to make sure we move towards a balanced budget. We got to get rid of these tax cuts, of course. And even after we do, we're not going to have any room to do anything else because all the spending policy space was used. Okay? And therefore, it's not our fault. We have no room to maneuver. We can't think about Social Security expansion or infrastructure spending ourselves or any of these things because we can't run deficits. It would be fiscally responsible. So the stage is being set for all this stuff. Okay. So, as I indicated, more than 2/3 of the increase in the deficit will go to people and corporations who will build their wealth accumulation further. And one of the things this does is increase their comfort in spending large quantities of money by our standards, not by theirs, to increase their control over our democracy. Take perhaps the final steps in eliminating it completely. Many people, including myself, think that we no longer have a democracy now, and that what we have to do is to take that back. But you can be sure they will do the very best they can to eliminate any chance that we can take that back. So, inequality is likely to further increase in consequence of these tax cuts. And deterioration in public facilities and spaces and services will probably continue, and the United States will continue its decline to the level of a developing nation, which many commentators are now saying that we are very much like in most of the United States, other than in the big and busy cities of the two coasts. So that is the bias in this bill. There may be other things that will be done to offset the bias. We may be more successful with our movements, and we may be able to get certain things through somehow that are in line with the public purpose, such as actual job-creating measures, such as a Medicare for All bill, such as certain climate change measures. Those things may yet happen if the Republicans take a real big hit in 2018, and if Trump finds himself having to deal with the very aggressive, which is a progressive Congress. I leave the question open as to whether that will be a Democratic Congress or a combination of certain progressives within the Democratic Party and other progressives in one of the newer parties that are attempting to get started. We don't know now what the full situation will be in 2018. I have hopes, though, that our future will not be in the Democratic Party, at least as it's constituted right now. So, that is the bias in this bill. That is the future that it will tend us toward. So, while there is no reason to oppose these tax cuts, because taxes fund spending, because we know it is spending, there's plenty of reason to greatly oppose this bill on grounds of economic justice, on grounds of not wanting inequality to further increase, not wanting a further increase in the influence of the billionaires on our political system. Okay. And so that's the way I analyze it at this point. Let's move on now. If we have time, do we have time, Steve?
We do indeed, sir. It's 9 o'clock. We can go until you're ready.
Okay. So let's talk about Donald Trump and what we're seeing, what we're getting a glimmer of in relation to his trade policies. Let's distinguish, to start with, five types of overall trading policies or guidelines. There is free trade on the classical Ricardian model, laissez-faire, true laissez-faire, true domination of the international market in trade. Now, we really haven't seen that in a very long time. The current trading regime, as it has developed over time, and as it is now represented in the NAFTA and the other recent trade agreements we have, carries forth the slogan of free trade and the supposed benefits, of free trade, which are by no means established. It uses those slogans all the time and claims to be free trade. But when you remove the veil, it is plain that it is trade managed by and for the benefit of globalizing plutocratic elites, and not for anybody else's benefit. The trade bills that are passed are all about the protection of capital, not just but, but also capital in terms of the factories, and to a great extent, intellectual capital of the plutocratic elites is protected in these bills. But all the various capital investments, okay, that they've made are protected in these treaties against the possible ravages of capital by democratic governments that have lost patience with the domination of their nations by the plutocrats. So that's the trading regime right now. It's not a free trading regime. It's a trade regime which is managed and dominated by rules that protect and benefit the capital of the plutocrats. So, okay, free trade is different, okay, than that. And is probably better than that. But it also doesn't have any guarantees of fairness in it. It treats nations as monolithic wholes. The models supporting it do not contain a dynamic component, and there's no guarantee in free trade that over time certain countries will come to dominate the international markets, and certain other countries will lose out entirely. I know there are things in the theory, okay, of free trade, which claim that this cannot happen. But there are also theories of the free market as applied to domestic affairs, which say that over time the free market will lead to the benefit of all. If there's free internal trade. We know this is not true because we know there's a tendency within free markets within countries for monopolies to develop, oligopolies to develop, for companies to become dominant that can manage and manipulate their markets. We've known that for a long time, and there are no protections in free trade theory itself to stop this from happening. Similarly, in the area of international trade, there are no protections to stop this from happening in the area of international exchange. Perhaps the classic example of this is the very example used by Ricardo to justify his favored free trade policies, which was the two-nation, two-product case. Two products, wines and textiles. When relationships between Portugal and the UK, or what was then the UK, I should say, England, and I guess it probably was the UK at this time, it was the case that Portugal had advantages in both of those areas, in wine and in clothes, okay, in textiles. But It turned out that advantage, okay, of England was less in the textiles area, was in the wine area. So if one had free trade between the two countries, what would happen, according to Ricardo, and what did happen, is that England that it was great. There was a greater advantage in having a trading system between these two nations in terms of immediate returns, because Portugal could specialize in wine, and England could specialize in the textiles, and then over time, consumers in both countries would be getting the benefit of the increasing efficiency in the production of textiles and increasing efficiency in terms of the production of wine. They'd be getting a better quality in both areas. Citizens of both countries would. And they would be getting as well a lower cost than they otherwise would have been getting without the trading relationships. But what this didn't take account of course, was the fact that when England could specialize in the textiles area and Portugal chose to specialize in the wine areas, Portugal condemned itself to remain a primarily rural agricultural country, whereas England had the Industrial Revolution. Anyway, Ricardo's theory doesn't take account of those kinds of dynamic effects. Okay. So, free trade is not necessarily trade for the public purpose. There's also balanced trade. The great advocate of this is Warren Buffett. What he wants to do is to see to it that over a short period of time, there are no trade imbalances between nations. He wants to have a system of credits, and penalties, which enforces that on nations, so trade is always balanced. Well, this can be done. There's nothing that says this can't be done. And then the United States would no longer have trade deficits every year, whereas China would no longer have trade surpluses every year. But at the same time, there's no guarantee and there's no built-in tendency for balanced trade policy to have the effect of being in line with the public purpose of the countries involved in such a trading regime. There's no demonstration in the theory at all. It's just assumed that public purpose is served by balanced trade. There's no proof, there's no theoretical proof, there's no modeling to support it. It's just not there in terms of a rationale. It's based on the primitive idea, we don't like these trade deficits, and we want to get rid of them and have a more even situation. So we don't have to have the trade deficits all the time. And we don't have to have the unemployment caused by them all the time. So it's just based on that simple notion or idea. Okay, the next, there's fair trade. Fair trade is a little more complicated because there are three different senses of the term fair trade policy. First, there's the sense of that fair trade is producing commodity goods for foreign trade in humanly sustainable way. And if everybody does that, then trade will be fair. Then there's a second sense. That sense is that the trading nations conforming to international standards on safeguarding the environment, also protecting workers who produce goods for international trade, and ending currency manipulation. And what's also involved in this kind of a regime is disempowering corporate-dominated tribunals to overturn laws passed by democratically elected legislatures. This is the kind of fair trade that's supported by Global Trade Watch, by people like Lori Wallach, and also very good people, especially Lori Wallach, who did a wonderful job in helping to defeat the TPP. Okay, and then third is the strand of fair trade policy that deals with differences that we find among nations in their stage of economic development and the differences in capability to be successful in a competitive trading environment. A partisan of this kind of fair trade is Joe Stiglitz. He's very sensitive to the fact that nations just starting out, or even at early stages of their development economically, cannot be competitive with more advanced nations, and that their industries, their nation industries, have to be protected to some degree from the international market, because it's just unfair to expose them. They can't possibly be successful in it until they've had a chance to make the proper amount of investment and to use their domestic markets to sell to. So that advocates for domestic markets that are protected from. So industry, which is native to those nations, is able to develop, and they are able to modernize. And that's a position which is very reasonable. I think all these fair trade notions are very reasonable. And I think that all of them are groping towards the idea of trade for public purpose. But I don't think that any of them reach that particular standard. And that is now the fifth kind of trade, or trade policy, that I'm mentioning here. What I believe is that our trade policies and our trade treaties should conform to the standard of trade for public purpose. And that means evaluating trade treaties that are proposed and also negotiating them in accord with the likely effects of those trade treaties on all the dimensions of public purpose that we previously discussed here. Okay, so that means that I don't know how many we discussed. Do we discuss altogether 17 dimensions, okay, of public purpose, which are economically significant? Okay, that would include um, 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 our efforts to negotiate and to adjust trade treaties so that they were consistent with our desired fiscal and our desired environmental policies and our desired policies for climate change. The trade treaties would have to accommodate themselves, and the trade policies would have to accommodate themselves to all those things. The only standard would not be a balanced trade or fair trade, or whether free trade, okay, is beneficial to certain people, okay, and not to other people. Trade policies and trade treaties would have to run the same kind of gauntlet in relation to evaluation of those policies that our domestic fiscal policies should be running. Okay. And in fact, trade for public purpose policy should be in with our domestic fiscal policies so that they're not in conflict with one another. And right now, there are blatant conflicts. In other words, the fact that our trade policies cause a weak labor market here, which can be exploited by the elites by keeping people unemployed, okay, and underemployed, and keeping wages low, and that are exacerbating inequality. Well, these trade policies are all inconsistent with a number of other goals. To bring them into line with other goals, policies, or change the domestic policies, or change both. And this has to be approached in an integrated way. Right now, the legislative efforts are not performed in an integrative way at all. It seems like the area of trade is entirely independent of other areas. And the areas of domestic economic policy are also entirely independent, okay, of other areas. These things cannot be independent. We're dealing with a whole political economy here, with a whole system, and we will never solve our problems if we can't get the policies for different sectors of the economic world structured in such a way that they form a coherent whole with respect to public purpose. So the standard that we want to keep in mind here should always be trade for public purpose. Now, what kind of policy is the Trump administration fixing to follow? It seems like, whatever they say, that they're not really interested in free trade. They don't seem to be the least bit interested in balanced trade. I know they're not interested in fair trade. And we know they're not interested in trade for public purpose because Trump apparently never does anything for public purpose. This is trade managed by and for the benefit of the plutocratic elites. And the difference between the Trump trade policies that are emerging just now and the Obama trade policies that we've seen for so long, okay, are not caused by the fact that one is representative of free trade and one is representative of trade managed by and for the benefit of the plutocrats. Okay. It is that these trade policies are being developed in order to benefit different plutocrats, elites which are to some degree different from the elites that Obama was trying to benefit with his trade policies. That's seeing a difference in the elites who will benefit. There's a great, but they're also distinct in certain ways. Okay? So that's what we're seeing. But why do I say we're seeing that? Because what is Trump doing? When he ran, he was attacking the TPP on various grounds, including his echoing of Jeff Sessions talking about how the TPP was compromising the sovereignty of the United States, and how NAFTA was compromising the sovereignty of the United States. He opposed the multilateral trade deals concluded since Bill Clinton took over the presidency. But what is he doing now? He is backing off. We never hear about the sovereignty problems anymore. More disturbingly, there are signs that in his redoing of NAFTA, there will be no change in the critical investor-state dispute settlement procedures. These are the procedures that raise the problem for Americans and for citizens of other nations, that international arbitration tribunals staffed by corporate lawyers, employed in many cases by the very corporations that they're judging in the arbitration tribunals, that tribunals constituted like this are supreme over, in our nation, the Article III courts. Article III courts are our court system as specified in the Constitution of the United States. Our U.S. court system, headed by the Supreme Court of the United States. Our Supreme Court does not get to review the decisions of the arbitration tribunals. It does not get to decide whether the decisions of the tribunals should be overturned because they're in conflict with U.S. law, existing U.S. law. These arbitration tribunals are illegal and are unconstitutional because there has been no amendment to the Constitution defining any courts or tribunals that can hierarchically be independent of the judgments of the Supreme Court and the lower courts in our system. The international arbitration tribunals are not the fourth branch of our government or the fifth branch of our government. They have to be subject to the decisions of the Supreme Court and our court system. They have to be suable, open within our court system. It is beyond the power of Congress and the executive to conduct agreements that are invulnerable to review by our court system. That is not something that they had the authority under the Constitution to give away. Under the Constitution, there are only three branches, okay, of our government. And the judicial, or third branch, is the final arbiter of legal matters. International arbitration tribunals. The arrangements we have now are giving away the sovereignty of the U.S. government along various dimensions. They also exacerbate and create a further danger of fascism in the member states, because fascism is government for the benefit of the corporations. It is very explicit about that. And even though the international tribunals are not fascist themselves, they are in a position to prevent the passage of, in each of the individual countries, to contain and reform and end the dominance of the corporate elites over our economic system and over our political system. And that is why the international tribunals and these international trade deals reinforce the tendency towards fascism we already see in our systems. And that is the most important reason, more important than difficulties with labor or currency manipulation or unfair trade, all the other difficulties that arise from these treaties. The worst difficulty is that these treaties undermine our court system and with it our democracy. And this has to be stopped. Even Jeff Sessions knew that when he was in the Congress. He seems to have forgotten it since then. So remember Trump's budget, outlines of which were given as soon as he got into office. There were 10 bad proposals in it. It cut college tuition aid. It made massive cuts to the EPA. It slashed research on diseases. It eliminated Meals on Wheels. It eliminated regional and rural economic investment. It eliminated transportation grants. It eliminated programs that helped to pay for home energy costs. It eliminated funding for the arts. It cut funding to low-income mothers and children. Thank you. And it funded the border wall, and also deportation. Now, to those proposals, which were bad, we must now add the trade proposals of Trump, which of course have an impact on the budget and the budget proposals. And also Trump's tax plan, which has a great impact on the budget proposals also. Now, I don't know whether Trump is going to be able to pass any of the budget proposals that he has given. He will probably get some of it, but I can't say which ones at this point. I can't see what impact it's going to have. Clearly, in spite of their large majorities in the House, the Republicans are running scared. The majority in the Senate is also smaller, and they're running scared there. So there are checks on their acting like total barbarians. They haven't gotten into the swing of that yet, quite. They're afraid to do certain things. And they might be afraid to pass the 10 bad proposals in Trump's budget. Just as they haven't bitten the bullet on healthcare reform yet, and just as they appear to be reluctant to go through, well, I won't say to go through, but I'll say they're less than enthusiastic about Trump's tax plan at this point. A lot of people consider it to be dead on arrival in the House, and even more so in the Senate. I hope so. But I think what we have to keep in mind is that when we add the areas of micro austerity represented by the bad proposals in his budget, and then we add the likely impact of these terrible trading policies, which he appears to be trying to implement with a very plainly and public sharp eye towards how he himself and his family will benefit. Then we get a big picture which is even worse than just the bad proposals in his budget. We get a picture that looks like a disaster for the American people. Not because of the macro austerity, but because of the micro austerity, because of the Trump trade for purposes of looting on behalf of the plutocrats, and also because of the possible effects of a political nature of these tax cuts on the future. Just as the Reagan tax cuts had the effect of mortgaging the future, because it pushed the Democrats into the corner opposing the effects of the tax cuts, and so created a very bad environment for progress to be made by the Democratic Party during the 1990s when they finally took over again. And just as the Bush tax cuts poisoned the possibilities for a really economically progressive Obama administration, these Trump tax cuts are likely to do the same thing again, even if progressives take over in 2018 and 2020. So we need to work to overturn these tax cuts. We never want to lie about them and say that we need the money going for the tax cuts for tax revenue, because we don't want considerations of expediency to distort our story over a period of time, our narrative over a period of time. We need to be consistent between what we believe and what we say. But there are plenty of reasons to oppose these tax cuts. There are plenty of reasons to oppose them, which do not involve any sort of opposition on grounds that we need the tax revenue. So, any further questions, comments, misgivings?
I see a lot of discussion, Joe, but I don't see a lot of questions. I see a lot of people talking about things that are on their mind as it pertains to how this knowledge made them wake up and realize what was going on around them. But I don't see a whole lot of questions. But I tell you one thing, though, there was an awful lot. It's been seen over 1,000 times already, my friend. So the words got out. People are able to hear, and that's a good thing. That's a tremendous thing.
Okay.
All right, folks.
Okay. Are there no questions I should answer right now?
None that I see, just a lot of thank yous and highs.
Okay.
All right. So with that, let me just say thank you very much for Joe for coming out here, giving us an hour and 40 minutes of pure knowledge on a Tuesday night at that. So thank you so much, Joe. And folks, Mike Sionato will be on the air tomorrow night at 8 p.m. And we look forward to seeing you again real soon. Have a great night, everybody. And for Joe and I, have a good night. Take care now.
Okay, take care, everyone, and take care, Steve.
Thank you, sir.
See you next time.
Yes, sir.
Bye.
Bye-bye.